morning. I'm Elisa Martinuzzi, EMEA Finance and Markets Editor at Reuters, and thank you very much for joining me today. I have a great pleasure to introduce this panel, the discussion that we're hosting today on giving intangibles real value. Real honor to have such a diverse group of viewpoints on an important topic. So thank you for joining me. Intangible assets, such as intellectual property rights, data, algos, they all account for an increasing share, as you know, of economic activity across many economies. But this does pose challenges, and we're here to learn a little bit more today about, how we can go about improving how we measure intangibles, how we ensure competition, which of course is increasingly important. Let me quickly introduce the panelists. Over to my right, Ufuk Akcigit, Professor of Economics at the University of Chicago. On my left, Erik Brynjolfsson, Director of the Digital Economy Lab at Stanford. Then we have Eva Maydell, Member of the European Parliament. Daren Tang, Director General of WIPO. And Nancy Xu, Founder and CEO of MoonHub. Welcome, everybody. According to WIPO, intangible investments outpaced tangible consistently across many economies since 2008. And just to give you one more data point, in the US, in 2023, intangible investments as a share of GDP were nearly twice the size of tangible investments, again, according to the same study. Yeah. And that's one of the points that we're going to be touching on. So, Erik, I thought I'd come to you first. Sure. Intangible assets have become increasingly important in economic value creation and evolving business models. But how has this shift affected how businesses and economies operate, but also innovate?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question, Elisa. This is, I think, one of the most important measurement issues in the economy today. In previous eras, we mostly created value with tangible assets, but now software, business processes, firm-specific human capital are all much more important, and as you mentioned, constitute the majority of value. The difficulty is that intangibles, almost by definition, are difficult to measure, but we've been developing some techniques to do that. And one of the things you can do, of course, is look at the market value of a company and compare that to the tangible assets, and then there's something else there. And then if you do regressions and use Hall's quantity revelation theorem, you can separate out how much of that value is due to changes in prices versus changes in quantities. And further, you can take an analysis and look at how that correlates with various digital investments. So we've done all that using that. And what we found is, as you're saying, there's a tremendous explosion in the value of digital assets. In the 1990s, much of that was due to higher prices with the dot-com bubble. Now we're at an all-time high again, and if you separate out the total market value of those digital assets, most of it is actually due to higher quantity, not just prices. So it really is a real transformation of the economy as companies depend on these digital assets to create value. One of the reasons it's important for an economy is that we are increasingly mismeasuring where value comes from, and there's something we call the productivity J-curve that reflects this. When a powerful new digital technology comes along, like AI or earlier digital technologies, or any general purpose technology for that matter, even the electricity, what often happens is there's sort of a lull in productivity, in measured productivity, before it takes off. And one of the reasons that's happening is during that lull, companies are redesigning their business processes, employees are reskilling their workforce, they're coming up with new software and algorithms. All of that creates real value, but it's unmeasured. It's intangible value. So our GDP doesn't account for it. So on paper, it looks like they're all working really hard, no output is coming out. So it seems like, oh, that's very unproductive. Of course, that's very misleading. They are being productive, it's just in things that we aren't measuring well. And then later, when they start to harvest those digital capital and use that to create goods and services, then we see an explosion of output. And then the mismeasurement goes the other way. Now you're getting all this output, but where's it coming from? It's coming from these invisible digital assets. So now we're overestimating productivity. And you can see how that generates a J-curve. At first you underestimate, and then you overestimate. To put a real point on it, I believe the past few years we've been in the lower part of the J-curve, and we're about to have the takeoff of the higher part of the J-curve. if we were able to more systematically measure digital capital and other intangible assets, as we do in our paper, Digital Capital and Superstar Firms, then we would be able to have a better understanding of that whole phenomena, not just over time, but also across industries, across companies. And I'll just make one last point. When we did this analysis, and it's in our paper with Lauren Hitt, Sunny Tambe, and Daniel Rock, Digital Capital and Superstar Firms, one of the most striking things was we could attribute it to firms, and almost all of the digital capital being created is in just 10% of the firms. It's extremely skewed, and some of it is in the next 10%, but the bottom 80% had very little digital capital formation. So this is something that's leading to a great deal of concentration and inequality.
Thank you, Erik, and I think that brings you very nicely to Ufuk Akcigit. To what extent would you say the benefits of intangibles are now concentrated in advanced economies? Love to hear your thoughts on that.
Intangible capital, when we look at the data, is very much concentrated in the hands of a few countries. US, a subset of European countries like Germany and France, and then Japan and Korea. But there are many more countries around the world, obviously, so that's why there's quite a bit of inequality in terms of how much intangible capital is being produced. Of course, intangible capital and also AI revolution gives the feeling that, there are now new opportunities for, especially for emerging economies, to leapfrog. But, this is just one thought, but it needs to be executed. And when we look at around the world, indeed, even in this Davos, even Europe is now worried that Europe is falling behind, and they need to change the regulatory environment and also do the right infrastructure investment. But we should also realize that use of intangible capital is also a culture, a matter of culture, because you need to move fast, break things. And if you're not open to change, if you're not open to disruption, then probably this is also not going to necessarily deliver the fruits. Another thing that has to be taken into account is that what kind of intangible capital investment countries should do depends on their level of development. For instance, if a country is really a low income, it doesn't yet have the capability. First, the country needs to have the capability, and then it needs to have the willingness to do it. The capability aspect is really critical here. And if you don't have the capability, if you just give government subsidies for companies to innovate, it will just be a waste of resources, and we see examples of that. For instance, when you look at Brazilian economy, there have been massive interventions in terms of R&D subsidy, but the outcome hasn't been very, very fruitful. On the other hand, we have also some success stories too, like Korea, for instance. In 1965, when they started their whole economic move, the first thing they realized is that they are not capable of delivering the intellectual property. First, they went for imitation or infusion. They licensed a lot of the technologies from Japan and the US. And first, they learned about those technologies, they built capability, and then they start innovating. And the prime example is Samsung, which used to be a noodle company at the time. But thanks to all these right steps, the government specifically provided subsidies not for innovation, but for licensing. After building the capability, the countries start to innovating. So that's why countries really need to go step by step rather than trying to jump all the way to leapfrogging innovation.
Thank you, Ufuk, and we're fortunate enough to have somebody who can tell us about what policymakers are thinking about. Eva, I noticed a recent statistic that in the European Union, only 9% of SMEs own intellectual property rights. Economies that are driven, largely by SMEs. What's your thinking at the moment on what policymakers ought to be prioritizing and how?
I think it's probably one of the most challenging times to be a policymaker, not just because of the geopolitical situation. By the way, we're only in January 2025. I mean, the amount of challenges that we see before us from every aspect, particularly in Europe, security and defense, economic advancement, technological revolution that is continuous and ongoing. And I'll pause there because this is probably the most challenging area for policymakers. And why is that? I think it's the first time we're faced with something that moves faster than expected, and we have way too little knowledge and understanding. And perhaps the first thing we have to do is to lower and bridge that gap of knowledge of policymakers about technological advancements and developments. Why do I say that? Because you can only make the right choices and decision as a policymaker, whether it's for putting guardrails or for enabling your economy, if you actually understand new technologies, if you understand the value of intangibles, if you're able to understand the complexity that technology such as artificial intelligence poses to our societies, but in the same time the advancements it can make for our economies. And I have noticed that this is probably the most problematic area. The inability of policymakers to go beyond the headlines and to dive a little bit deeper into a subject. Only then we could see, I would like to say, the bigger picture that's before us. I can talk particularly for Europe, and I think we have been well known for adopting numerous legislations, particularly in the technological space. And I think some of them are very important because Europe, after all, when you talk about culture, Europe has a specific culture, and top and prime in that culture is to protect our citizens, to make sure we ensure safety, to make sure that our rights are protected. And this is why a lot of those legislations were proposed. I think they're important, and I think we need to have those guardrails and frameworks. However, in the same time, we need to be putting a path of how we could make sure that innovation in those sectors is happening. And I agree, it should not be about leapfrogging necessarily. And I think for a long time in Europe, what we have tried to do is replicate what someone else does and have the same companies. So on that second part of how to unleash the economy, I think we need to look where our strengths are. And Europe's strengths are in our traditional industries. And sometimes I think the champions are not just those that create a technology, but those that apply it, those that use it. So I would like to see policymakers understand that in Europe and create a path where our traditional industries can apply AI and new technologies to make sure that our economy grows, that we can lead, and those traditional champions that we've had and we still have in a way can compete among the top 10, 20, 30 companies in the world again.
What does that mean in terms of, in more practical terms, in terms of specific policies that one might think about?
Well, what I think what it means is, because we already have quite a lot of legislation, and one of them, particularly when we talk about data, is called the Data Act. It aims to unleash the industrial data and to help exchange of industrial data between B2B and B2C. It will begin and be enforced at the end of this year, and we'll see if it will bring the value that it's expected to bring. However, what it means in practical terms, I think, is having honest and open conversations between those that create the value, be it tech companies or other companies, policymakers, civil societies. The forum has a number of those gatherings, but often, at least in Europe, we look in fixing problems of the past. We need to be looking ahead, and I think we need to be, because while you look on the past, you often focus only on the problems where you're lagging behind what went wrong. And I think we need to be better understand how the next 2, 3, 4 years will look like in order for policymakers to be able to make more informed decisions. But I believe in order for us to trust new technologies, to fully reap their value, we'll also need to be able to trust them. That is both for consumers and businesses, because in Europe, a lot of those companies and statistics that you mentioned, they are not feeling comfortable. They do not have the trust in new technologies in order to apply them in their traditional methods and ways. So there's quite some work to do on that end.
Indeed. We also need a framework of policies and institutions, right, that foster innovation, ensure equal market access and sharing of knowledge. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, first, let me just say that there's a lot of points being made by the previous speakers that I totally agree with. And WIPO, which is a global agency, the UN agency for intellectual property, innovation and creativity, Our estimate is that global value of intangible assets has crossed the $60 trillion mark, which means that right now it's more than the size of the 5 largest economies in the world. And that's because as economies pursue innovation, technology, models of growth, and as a global agency, we see that happening across the world. Asset value and asset creation shifts from tangible assets to intangible assets. And so the report that you mentioned, that WIPO did in collaboration with the LUISS Business School in Italy, showed that investments in intangible assets surpass investments in tangible assets, right? I think about 2005 or 2006. And what's interesting is that it's not just the mature industrialized economies that are involved in this. The engines of this growth is increasingly coming from emerging economies. So India has the fastest growth in tangible asset investments. And the report does not even include data from South Korea or from China. So imagine when we bring in that data, right? We're going to look at Brazil, Morocco, and all of that. So what's happening around the world is that, and I think the pandemic accelerated this shift towards the intangible, the digital economy. And so I think what we need to do is that we need to stop looking at IP and intangible assets purely from a legal angle. There is a perspective and there is a tradition, right, in many parts of the world, policymakers, that even if they pay attention to IP at all, they look at it as a bundle of legal rights, and that's not enough. It's like saying, it's like going to the Minister of Trade and telling that person, right, that it's all about contract law. That's not the point, you see. The foundation is the legal rights, but IP has become a key business asset, and other forms of intangible assets, it's become even a financial asset. So I think what WIPO is trying to do is to help the whole world, developing, but especially developing and emerging, to look at IP, right, as a key catalyst for growth and development. How do we do that? We help them to reform their national IP policies, connecting it much more to their developmental journey, connecting it to the ambitions to drive a digital economy, the creative economy. And then after that, we help them to implement it. So example, right, the professor mentioned that it needs an ecosystem approach. No point, trying to create and throwing money at research or in universities, right, if there's no ecosystem to absorb that technology and to commercialize it. So one of the things that we do, for example, right, is that we train people in using IP from a commercial angle, from a business angle. And WIPO has a WIPO Academy that trained 500,000 people in the last 4 years. We've become the world's largest IP training institute because we've stopped training just IP lawyers and IP attorneys. We are training business owners, startup founders, entrepreneurs, right, in IP. So our courses are courses like IP for startups, IP for mobile app developers, IP for exporters, right? And the majority of the 80% of the 500,000 are from developing countries. And what's interesting is that we need to move away from the narrative that this is a Europe, North America, Northeast Asia issue, right? Because WIPO did a survey last year of the attitudes towards IP across the whole world. We surveyed 25,000 people in 50 countries. And attitudes towards IP was much more positive in Asia and Africa than in Europe and North America. And I don't know why. We're trying to figure out why. Maybe, some of you may have some answers. But my own view on this is that...
Can you say what you mean by attitudes towards IP? What does that mean?
That means that, do they feel that IP is beneficial to society?
Really?
Is it beneficial for economic growth? Is it going to give them opportunities?
Wow.
So we surveyed 25,000 laypersons. So it's not IP experts or IP attorneys.
That's really
That's interesting, yeah.
Because most of the IP revenues probably go to the developed countries from the developing countries.
But that's changing as well. 80% of IP is now filed from Asia, Africa, and Latin America. So the narrative, right, that IP is a tool by developed countries to maximize value, that's shifting, see, because increasingly more and more developing countries are innovating, they're creating. India has become the 6th largest filer of patents in the world, and India has become the 4th largest filer of trademarks in the world. ASEAN has overtaken France, Germany, and UK in terms of trademark filing. So the world has changed. And I think this is great for all of us because as more and more people from around the world innovate, they create, they become entrepreneurial, right? We have more solutions for solving the challenges that we face. So I think we're living in an amazing point of transition in innovation and creativity, and I think that's fantastic for all of us.
And you touched on a few points, which lead me nicely to Nancy Xu,
Yes.
who I want to tap as our representative of business here. What is your experience in terms of how intangibles are, for example, reshaping talent and its economic value? Would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's such a great question. So I live in Silicon Valley and I run an AI company. So I come from this conversation from the perspective of how do we actually think about the intangibles from the lens of promoting innovation for people around the world, and in a way that actually gives all of us access and improves humanity, right? And so from those lenses, I think there are two very interesting topics that I think about and that I think we should all be thinking about. The first is the role of talent in intangible assets, right? So what are intangible assets? Intangible assets are your algorithms, your data, and increasingly the access to human capital and talent that you have on your teams. And I think from that lens, it's very underappreciated that 60% of the global GDP comes in the form of wages. And labor is a big part of our market today, and I think the value of that human capital will only continue to increase as companies are formed more and more by intangible assets, and their values is derived from intangible assets. I'll give an example, right? There are a lot of these massive AI companies like OpenAI in the Bay Area. I would argue that for many of these companies, their biggest assets are their talent. And in the United States, especially in California where I live, we largely don't enforce non-competes. And I think this is a great thing for innovation and the economy because a lot of the ability to actually innovate now lives in the brains of people, and that is an intangible asset, and that can actually be carried over to many different organizations and help these organizations create and build new teams.
Sorry, Nancy, do you think we're all valuing that talent accurately, or do we really need to rethink how we value that talent?
I ask the same question when I see how much people at OpenAI are making. So I think we have in general, to your point, Erik, I think in intangibles right now, we have a broad question of how do we measure them, how do we properly attribute them, and then how do we actually properly activate those assets for the greater good of not just a single company, but for humanity as a whole. And so to answer your question, I think we have a ways to go in understanding how to properly measure those assets. But the second point I want to make is when you think about AI, which is something that I work a lot on, we need to start framing the conversation around intellectual property and these intangible assets in a different kind of way. And I'll give you a very specific example, right? We all talk about copyright. And Erik, you and I were just talking about this behind the scenes, but copyright is derived literally from the idea of copying something and protecting the right to copy it. Now, with AI, that completely changes because AI doesn't necessarily copy what it sees on the web, but it does learn on the data that content creators or publishers or authors are actually putting out there. And so I think increasingly what we're going to see is perhaps it's not the notion of copyright, but there will be some notion of what I call learn right, which is the right to actually learn on data. And for all of us as humans, no one stops us from reading a book. But with AI, because so much value is getting derived from the AI reading the books and reading the articles on the internet, that there is actually something to be said about how do we properly attribute that value. And then secondly, once you do attribute that value, how do we actually create a system that enables content creators, authors, publishers to derive some of that value in a measured way and actually be able to utilize it for the greater good in a way that ideally doesn't limit the access to that content to a particular group of individuals.
Nancy, thanks so much. I think, Erik, you had a couple of points to make on this?
Yeah, I love that phrase, learn right, because it's exactly correct that existing copyright law in the United States, it's actually in the US Constitution, there's a clause that says that the goal is to provide incentives for the creators of the useful arts and sciences. And copyright is meant, and patents and trademark, other IP, are meant to encourage incentives. Economists care a lot about incentives. And if somebody makes an exact copy of something, that's clearly a copyright infringement. But now, the existing statutes didn't really contemplate the idea that a machine, a large language model, could ingest a lot of information and then generate something that's novel but is really derived from this content. And so we may need a new regime. I've been talking to some senators, and I suspect there's some legislation coming out to clarify this. And the reason that's important is that you still want to do what it says in the Constitution, give the incentives for content creators to come up with new content. And if the downstream LLMs don't have to compensate them at all, then over time there's going to be less and less original content created, and then the system will unravel and you get system collapse. So what we're working on with Zoe Hitzig and Gabriel Unger at Stanford is a economic model that's based, go take it down to the bare bones, like never mind what all the existing statutes are. How would you attribute the value and ultimately the incentives? What is the economic model? And we are using a incomplete contracts framework to understand how you would then reward the content creators based on how much value they create. If a content creator has something that's very generic that everybody knows, then they aren't entitled to much value. But if they create something very original that's novel and that's very useful, then they're entitled to more. And by codifying that, and ultimately I think some kind of platform like ASCAP or BMI does for music will be needed. And I know several entrepreneurs are developing such platforms. And if we do that correctly, I think there's going to be an explosion of value on the downstream end, and some of that value will go back to the content creators, and then they'll have even more incentives to create more content and will create a virtuous cycle.
A theme that's very dear to our hearts, of course, as a journalist, the content that we create and the value that...
Well, journalists are being hammered right now, and a lot of the revenues are going down for journalism. And, in the short run, the downstream people can make some money like that, but in the long run, they're eating their seed corn. If there isn't real content being created, that's not going to be good for anyone.
I don't think you wanted to intervene.
I've got one small point, one bigger point. I think to the conversation on AI and content, right, it's a big controversy because we think it's going to disrupt the IP world. But as long as IP supports the human creator and looks at AI as a tool, and maybe through the use of technology that you're developing, and maybe there has to be some kind of more sustainable model where there's some form of licensing. Right now, there are 80 to 100 lawsuits around the world between the content creators and the tech companies. Yep. We're all waiting to see what the US courts say about fair use and whether it's transformative and all of that, right? But I think there has to be a more sustainable model than just lawsuits and that. So I think that's...
Agree. So trying to sort it out in the courts is, I think, very sloppy because the laws were not written with this in mind.
So WIPO convenes the world to talk about these issues, and we welcome all of you. This is a bit of a pitch. Join us for our next IP and frontier technology conversation. It's free, it's online. But the bigger point I want to make is that, and to Nancy's point about how do we measure the impact of talent and other forms of intangible know-how and knowledge, right? The problem is that intangible assets are the dark matter of the global economy. It's there, it's exerting an increasingly heavy pull on our economies, and yet we don't know how to value it properly. We don't know its connection to the finance system, the trading system. Global trade in IP has crossed $1 trillion. We don't even know how to account for it in our account books. So any of you are here in this room are entrepreneurs. If you create IP, you can't reflect it as an asset in your accounting books. Now, last year, the International Accounting Standards Body, that's based in New York, has said that they review the accounting standards and principles towards intangible assets. But right now, it's booked as expenses on the accounting books, which is crazy because you look at a company like Apple or or whatever it is, Samsung. Most of the value of its assets are in intangible assets. And we have to go through hoops like what Professor Erik is mentioning to sort of figure that out. So I think we have been geared towards understanding the economy, right, from an industrial perspective and not from an innovation perspective. And one of the things that we want to do at WIPO is to work with all of you to get a much better grip, right, understanding this. And whoever understands this new economy that's emerging will be able to help all the governments, emerging, developed, LDCs, right, to understand how to design policies to help people and to have benefits across the whole world. I think that's really, really critical.
Yes. So I think the talent aspect of this debate is probably the most important thing, because first, in order to understand the inequality implications or how inclusive this whole revolution is going to be, depends on where these inventors or these people, IP producers, are coming from. We have done very detailed studies on this, and we found some really interesting and important results. First, we asked a very simple question. What are the characteristics of the people who are producing patents? Those kids who are born to rich families are by far disproportionately more likely to become an inventor and patent producers. Then, what is the channel? The channel is, once you control for the educational attainment, parental income doesn't matter anymore, which means that inequality in the society will be filtering through the education, access to education. So that's why first we need to improve our talent pool, and to improve the talent pool, of course, we need to give equal opportunities when the kids are young. So that's number one. Number two, once you build the talent pool, I think the next question is, how are we going to use it? Rather than looking at the aggregate numbers, we need to look at the composition. And what's happening currently is that R&D to GDP ratio in the US has been increasing since 1980 from 2% up to 3.5%. Any growth theory would predict that we should grow faster in productivity. In return, there's a productivity slowdown. Why? There's a massive shift of innovative resources, including the inventors, towards large incumbents. And when we look at the microdata with Nathan Goldschlag, we studied this specifically. You follow the exact same inventor who moves to a large incumbent as opposed to a small firm. The wages are just skyrocketing immediately, but when you look at the innovative output, it's declining after moving to a large incumbent. Because yes, large incumbents were innovative in the past, but that doesn't mean that they will keep innovating. Innovation is affected by two things. First, capability. Large firms prove their capabilities. But the second thing is the willingness. Once you dominate the market, do you still want to break things and bring in some revolutionary technologies, or do you want to preserve your market? And one final result that I would like to quote that we documented with Salome Baslanze and Francesco Lotti, we asked a very simple question. As the firm is becoming the dominant market leader, what happens to innovativeness? Innovativeness is going down. Then what else is happening? The intensity of hiring politicians is increasing very rapidly. So we should really be mindful of these facts, and we should always recognize that there's a massive heterogeneity across firms and their incentive in the market. So that's why when we are designing policies, we have to also take into account these differential incentives.
And if I did want to ask you, well, you first and then I'll follow up.
I just wanted to come in because I think this discussion very well highlighted few of the issues that policymakers had to ponder and still have to ponder how to solve. And one of them was on copyright or learn right. So this has been a discussion that's been surfacing across the European institutions for the past couple of years, and is one of those discussions that we seem to have different opinions of how to go ahead. And so we worked on the European AI Act over the past couple of years, and even in that act we had a lot of pressure of defining how that relationship between creators and AI companies has to be exactly defined. However, we thought it's not the right place to define that relationship, and we left it to be done and dealt separately. This is one tiny aspect of how to go about new technologies and whether to put certain rules and boundaries. The Data Act is another example that I briefly mentioned, and I think is particularly interesting for this discussion. Hugely debated file. On one hand, if you look at it, what it will bring to the European economy in 5 years is estimated to be around 400 billion euros to our GDP. Sounds fantastic. Sounds, wonderful that if you have as a consumer data that's not personal data, the particular company can give it to you. If you're another industry that would like to have access to that data, you would have access to that data, but the person the entity that gives you the data will be remunerated. Sounds very good. But when you go into the details and start discussing how those relationships are regulated, you start to understand that those that own the data, the industrial data, are not very much willing, even if remunerated, to provide the data. In the same time, smaller companies are very excited to gain that data. And we end up in a situation where we often say, if no one's really happy, it means we strike the right balance. But all of a sudden, on every legislative file, we seem to make everyone rather unhappy than satisfied. And then it kind of also goes back into the trust of politicians, not in new technologies. And this is why I highlighted that I think regulating new technologies and the way the market works and economy works, or just trying to understand it, will be and is the most challenging thing for policymakers, simply because with some of the other issues we've dealt before, when it comes to security, defense, or global issues, we have experience, we have established institutions. And now, all of a sudden, there's on one hand demand from our citizens to make sure they're safe, and on the other hand, a huge pressure from the business side of wanting less rules and less regulations, wanting them to focus on their innovative ideas, which I do understand, because that's how we build progress in our societies. That's also how we ultimately build the European way of life and the European economic market and single market. But we can see the challenges. And just pondering on the question of copyright, I mean, it takes us years to figure out what's the right way of addressing it. And sometimes we find that companies try to work on that issue by themselves. But I don't think this is necessarily the right way.
Can I comment on this on the business perspective?
I just had a quick question for Eva, though, because I think everyone here has been in agreement about the need to harness the talent and the key. And I'm just wondering, do you think that EU policymakers are focused on that, and what could they be doing differently?
I think we are focused, but we can be doing way more, particularly for Europe. Europe has one of the best peer-to-peer reviews. We have wonderful startup companies, but somehow they fail to scale.
I'm not in agreement with you.
The data shows that indeed, the talent is not very well utilized in
No, but
Europe,
this I agree. So what I meant to say is that we are focused, but we can be doing way more. Because if you look at certain underlying data, you can see that Europe has the right basis, but somehow, for numerous reasons, we don't always manage to retain the talent. However, we have seen in the past couple of years a lot of those Europeans that have left, and maybe many of them are your neighbors in the Bay Area, are starting to slowly return for numerous reasons. One of them, as it might sound, it's not necessarily the most economically attractive one, but it goes back to culture, it goes back to the way of life, it goes back to the security Europe provides to its citizens, to its companies as well, and the protection that is there, which is exactly the opposite of what people think of when they think of innovation. They think less rules and openness. But I think, that's one of the reasons why they return, but we need to have a more clear way of attracting that talent, and I think we're not there yet.
And then I need to go to Nancy.
The educational policy, I think, has to be really tailored. We have to move away from, of course, the horizontal policies are important, but then we have to also focus on the vertical aspect of education. What do I mean by this? Universities are playing an extremely critical role for innovation. When we look at the educational background, what kind of educational degree do inventors have? They are primarily having PhD degrees. And that's why the PhD program, master's and PhD programs, they should be well-funded. There's a big gap between Europe and US when it comes to university funding, especially these, master's and PhD program funding. So that's why when we talk about education, there's this whole spectrum of education. The final thing I would like to mention on this particular issue is that when we look at the relationship between innovation and income inequality, there's not much relationship with the usual Gini coefficient, for instance, but there's a very strong relationship with the top one income inequality. So just because these are really very focused monopoly rents that's coming out of innovation, that's also making the income very, very concentrated at the very top. We have to be really mindful of that so that, we give the resources also to young people who are willing to train themselves to create their creativity.
Nancy, then I have one or two more questions, then I think we are opening up to the audience for questions. Nancy.
I just want to say, first, I appreciate that we're also aligned on the idea of intangible assets as it supports innovation. And I think this is incredibly important for us as an economy right now, and as well as for companies. And to your point, I think it's very important we do it in a responsible way. Now, I think there are many ways you can do this responsibly. And I think one of the most dangerous modes we can get in is to think about this as, let's say, an AI, broadly just the technology as the concept, as opposed to really thinking about the nuanced use cases and how it impacts people. And I'll give you an example, right? We don't regulate the internet as a whole and say no one can use the internet. We say, okay, there are certain use cases or things that we are concerned about, like social media, in which we then go address. Now, On the innovation front, I think part of why it's so challenging today is because the boundaries of what an asset is has actually changed a lot. So we all talk about IP as like a single entity, or in many cases like an actual tangible entity, but the fact that it's intangible makes it very hard to draw boundaries, right? So an example is if we had said no one, for the early Impressionists, and said, okay, no one can actually paint in the Impressionist style anymore because that style is a piece of intellectual property, we would never have had the Impressionism movement. And I think this is something we really need to think about, is like, what are the actual boundaries, and where do those boundaries have to be to, one, of course, support innovation, but then two, be in a way that will enable others to be able to use those technologies in a responsible manner. And that's where I think the challenge will ultimately be. And I think it's very important for us to, I don't think we have the right answers today fully, and I think we need to figure this out. But I think it's very important for us to have the courage and the humility right now as a society to be open to changing the way that we think about these assets, and this conversation is a start to it, and also be open to consistently and repeatedly have a dynamic conversation around it, and I think that's the most important thing as we go into this AI era.
Clearly quite a lot to say. We only have a few minutes, so
Very
10
brief,
seconds. And
very brief. AI Act, the way we did it is a risk-based approach. Some parts of the use cases of AI are not regulated. Others are considered high risk. On the high risk category, we had colleagues that thought every use case has to be high risk and to go through all the checks and balances. I fought against that. I thought there are certain risk cases that need to go through more checks and balances, and we have banned uses. So we tried this risk-based approach. We're still hugely criticized to a certain extent for the rules that we put, but we're also highly praised for putting the guardrails out there. But again, to strike the balance, it's been extremely difficult and hard.
Erik.
I think to address these challenges, we need to massively improve measurement, and that's really the core of it. You can't manage what you don't measure. I'm optimistic about that. I described a little bit, very quickly, some of the ways we're measuring the intangible assets, mostly the input side, but I want to emphasize that it's also, there's a massive mismeasurement on the output side. Digital companies are creating huge amounts of digital value, most of which people consume for free. And while GDP is one of the great inventions of the 20th century, and it measures all the things that are bought and sold, with few exceptions, if something has zero price, it has zero weight in GDP. And the average American spends about 8.5 hours per day looking at screens of various sizes. And so they're already voting with their time that they're mostly consuming digital content. I think it's similar in Europe and many other countries. We're not measuring most of that very well. At Stanford, we have developed a new measurement framework called GDP-B, where the B stands for measuring the benefits, not the costs. And if you do that, what you see is that there's trillions of dollars of digital value being created with this GDP-B measurement, as well as trillions of dollars of intangible assets. And so there's this whole dark matter of the economy on both sides that we're not measuring. But I am optimistic that we have some tools that will allow us to start measuring it. And for the 21st century, we need as much of a revolution as we had back with the GDP invention in the 1930s. That was great for the 20th century when they were measuring corn and steel and cars. But now for digital assets, we need GDP-B and these intangible measures.
There should be a room of 2,000 people and rather than just 30 people. More people need to hear these conversations, understand. Yeah.
We have like a minute and a half. Can we take, are there any questions from the audience? Does anyone, anybody burning questions? Right, I guess we've answered a lot.
It's Friday morning.
It's Friday morning. But I did have one more question, and I want to throw it open there, throw it to the entire panel here. We are potentially moving into an era of, trade wars. How does that feed into, the, intangibles and investments in intangibles? Can you,
Invention is a solo act, but innovation is a team sport. You need to collaborate to innovate. There's just no way about it. So my belief is that despite the trade tensions, and maybe because of the trade tensions, because people innovate and become more creative when there are constraints, I don't think it's going to stop this big movement, right, towards creativity, towards innovation, and then with that, right, towards intangible assets. That's my take on it.
All right.
I want to say the reason we're beginning to have trade wars is because economists really messed up globalization. We said that...
That's for another panel.
No, I'm going to link it. We said that this is going to make the pie bigger. There's going to be winners and losers, but with a bigger pie, we can make sure that everybody wins. Unfortunately, a lot of people were badly hurt by globalization, so we didn't share those benefits. Now, with technology and innovation, digitization, I think we're in danger of replaying that. Digital technologies are going to make the pie much bigger. They already are making the pie bigger, but once again, there are winners and losers. And if we don't assure that there's not just prosperity, but shared prosperity, where all people benefit from it, there's going to be an even bigger backlash, and that's going to lead to the kinds of troubles we're already seeing with trade.
Ufuk, and then I think we're out of time.
Okay, one final word. For innovation, spillovers are extremely important, especially international spillovers. An inventor who works with multiple people throughout his career ends up being much more productive. We see this in the data repeatedly. This is also important to utilize the diaspora. For developing countries who don't have the capabilities yet, utilizing diaspora abroad and doing international collaborations with them also overcomes the language barrier, which is a problem typically for innovation. That's why these protectionist policies are not the great news for innovation, but hopefully it's not there.
Vietnam and Cape Verde, they're doing
Absolutely.
Great. Yeah. Well, on that note, thank you very much. Thanks to the panelists for great dynamic conversation. Lots of food for thought. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elisa.
Thank you.